I'm Phil Bowen. I'm chair of today's webinar and director of the Centre for Justice Innovation. And before we get into the content of the webinar, I just want to say a couple of things in terms of housekeeping and just to register a couple of thank yous. So in terms of the webinar structure, the structure will be as follows. First, we will broadcast a video developed by Reality Art, a Tottenham-based youth arts project about young people's experience of the Youth Court. I will then hand over to Gillian Hunter from the Institute for Crime and Policy Research and Carmen de Cruz from the Centre to introduce the findings of the report. And then we will have a panel and a question and answer. So joining Jill and Carmen on the expert panel are the Right Honourable David Lammy MP for Tottenham since 2000, author of the Government Commissioned Review on Racial Disparity in the Criminal Justice System and current Shadow Justice Secretary. Kate Aubrey-Johnson. Kate is a criminal barrister at Garden Court Chambers and a child's right and youth justice expert advisor. Andy Peden, head of service at Leeds Youth Offending Service and current chair of the Association of Youth Offending Team Managers. And we're also joined by Shaheem Kati, Derek Agama and Moses Abuwam from Reality Art. While the report, we hope, identifies a number of adjustments and reforms we can make to the current system, I want to stress that we are clear that that shouldn't detract from the overwhelmingly positive view we got of yacht workers, of lawyers, of youth court officials and magistrates and judiciary and others, all striving to deliver a humane justice system for some of the most vulnerable in society. Finally, I wanted to thank the young people who we interviewed about their experiences in youth court and to whom we spoke to about the report's recommendations. We hope this report does justice to their experiences of the youth court and their hopes for reform. And that brings me nicely to introducing the video produced for us by Reality Art. We originally commissioned Reality Art to develop a physical installation for the council conference we were due to hold in March. The video we're about to show you, I hope, gives you a taste of the powerful installation they've created, and we hope, second wave permitting, to be able to invite you to that installation physically in the not too distant future.
Why does my mum have to work 3 jobs to get a minimum pay? Why are my shoes ripped? Why do I keep getting put in the internal exclusion room? Why do I have to provide for my family at such a young age? Why are there bullet holes in the door of my flat? Why don't I feel safe when I'm outside? Why does my local youth club always get shut down? Why do housing allow people to be homeless? Why? Why?
I don't know what's going on. I've just been sat outside for 2 hours waiting, getting more and more stressed.
I don't understand what's being said. They're using proper technical, long words. I'm so confused, so I'm just staying quiet.
They've called me in and I need to speak to my solicitor, but she's across the other side of the room.
I don't understand most things that they are saying to me. I'm scared because you don't know what they're going to say. They could say anything. There's so many people here looking down on me. I don't understand my sentence. It's just a load of numbers.
And I'm in court and I feel so anxious. There's all these people I don't know staring at me and I'm worried I won't be able to get my words out.
And in this courtroom, they're all looking down on me, looking at me like I'm some bad criminal. They should think about why I'm here in the first place. They should read about my history, my story.
Court in session. State your name and date of birth.
Hi, We started with Project Future, a community wellbeing project that gave us the tools and a spark to get it going. In 2016, Project Future gave us a challenge to create a movie about our life story. We created a film of all our lives, the ups and downs, then we did a premiere. In our research, we wanted to get young people's voices heard in a way that people would listen. We wanted it to have a bigger emotional effect, so we approached galleries and then we created Journey of the Shadows.
Wait there. Look, bro. Hello, people. You're right. I'm gonna give you a really strong awareness. Number one, awareness, what you need to know. And number two, what we do teach is awareness. You need to understand, when you're starting off with young people, trust is number one, what you need to build on. If you don't have that, how are you gonna get anywhere? Number two, we show you the ins and outs of how we used to live our lives and the bits of society, what people don't understand, get me? What people are blind to or secluded to, because no one just can wake up and do crime. Who does that? No one. So we give it ins and outs of our lives. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Derek Anthony, by the way. Riley, you know?
Yeah, wait, hold on a minute. Social distancing. Thank you. Really, art is about making people understand what it's like to live in the private areas. You are the voice for people with no voice. We do this by showing you creative art, which allows you to walk through and understand the reality that young people are living in. Through this exhibition, we wanted to take the audience through a journey. We wanted to help you understand the emotional scars and mental damage that young people are forced to normalize. All right, bye now.
So I hope you all agree that's a very powerful piece and gives you a taste of the installation they've created. And we hope, as I said, second wave permitting, to be able to invite you all to that installation in the not too distant future. I'll now invite Gillian Hunter, Senior Research Fellow at ICPR, to introduce the report's findings before she hands over to Carmen Robin de Cruz, Research Officer here at the Centre for Justice Innovation, to outline what we found from the perspective of young people.
Okay, thank you. This is a very brief overview of our research. The aims of the research were to gain some insight into youth court practice in 2019, with a view to identifying opportunities to develop problem-solving approaches. So initiatives that encourage a more proactive engagement with the court to address factors that might be underlying offending. I'm going to summarise our findings about day-to-day business in the youth courts and the youth offending services in our research sites, including their perceptions about the wider environment in which they were working, and then highlight the local innovations that we identified to support young people through their sentence. Carmen will then talk about what the young people we interviewed said about their recent experiences of court and what that might tell us about their understanding and engagement with the youth court. So the research was focused on 3 research sites, 3 youth offending services and 5 youth courts. It was a relatively small scale and exploratory study, but our findings resonate with national discussion and wider research about the youth court. Data collection largely involved qualitative interviews and focus groups with judiciary, court staff, youth offending service staff, and also young people who had recent experience of youth court as defendants. And also we undertook observations of youth court hearings and review hearings. And we'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the research. So we found strong support for ensuring that young people, wherever possible, get diverted from the system or receive out-of-court disposals. And where there were inappropriate cases slipping through to court, we found that the YOS were very active in flagging this. We were given a clear impression that there could be quite long delays between a young person being charged and the case coming to court, and this was particularly the case with more serious offences. In 2 sites, the police use of extended release under investigation coupled with postal requisition, was identified as causing delays and potentially disrupting the rehabilitative process. And this is because cases often came to court out of chronological order, such that a young person could be sentenced, be successfully engaging with the YOS, and then be brought back to court to deal with earlier offences. We were obviously interested in the extents and limits of specialism in the youth court. In terms of recommended layout, only 2 of the 5 courts in our sites had adapted courtrooms with the seating all arranged on one level and without a dock. And there was no way of making sure that the most vulnerable people in these sites could be sent to these adapted courtrooms. Most professionals working in youth court do undertake specialist training to work there, but there were concerns raised about the quality of some legal representation, so certainly amongst legal practitioners who didn't work regularly in the youth court. They were described by interviewees as sometimes being baffled and lacking awareness of the education and communication needs that are prevalent amongst young people at court. And one solicitor we interviewed described his youth court experience as a very much a learn-on-the-job type situation. Supporting young people to understand what's happening in court and encouraging them to engage is obviously an important element of professional practice. And we were told of and we observed a range of strategies that were being used to support young people's engagement. So child-friendly leaflets outlining court processes and who the different professionals were in the youth court, judiciary trying to use very accessible language, checking understanding of young people throughout the hearing and at sentencing. But practice was not always consistent, and Carmen can shed some further light on how young people experienced those various strategies. There was a high level of confidence on part of the judiciary and the court staff that the YOS could identify underlying needs of the young people who appear in court. And in all sites, there was evidence of very good working relationships between the YOS and the courts. And as well as detailed reports to support sentencing, the YOS were also alerting the court to potential difficulties a young person might have in understanding and participating in the hearing, and explaining pre-hearing any idiosyncratic behaviour that might be interpreted as disrespectful. In terms of responsive intervention, there was consensus that while needs were very well identified, a lack of resources limited the breadth and depth of support that could be offered to young people. And a sticking plaster analogy was used by one interviewee as a way to describe how well the system is able to address some of the more entrenched welfare and other needs of young people. And in terms of the multi-agency approach, again, there were concerns about the extent and quality of input from children's services and a lack of mental health provision to refer young people to locally. In each research site, youth courts had closed since 2010, youth benches had merged, and the number of magistrates available to sit in the youth court had reduced. And there'd also been some local restructuring to accommodate closures, so including the amalgamation of previously separate youth offending teams. And the more negative effects of those changes were reported to us as a loss of more experienced youth magistrates and disruption to long-established working relationships, although there was also a degree of optimism that that could improve over the longer term. Obviously, a main area of interest for us was the innovation that was happening locally that might be taking a more problem-solving approach. And one site was using informal review hearings for young people on youth rehabilitation orders, kind of live example of the type of problem-solving out-of-court approach that has been recommended by the Carlisle, Taylor and Lamy reviews. Magistrates take part in an informal way. These are run outside the court. They're voluntary sessions that are managed by the YOS, where young people and their parents or carers can attend. They're used as an opportunity to highlight achievements and progress and to discuss any problems or further support that might be offered. And there's a great deal of enthusiasm for this approach in this area, and they're very keen to share their experiences and learning. Another site was about to implement review and congratulate courts as a way to support people partway through their sentence. But I think across sites, we found an appetite among sentencers for knowing more about how young people did after they were sentenced. And often the obstacles to getting that kind of feedback were practical or financial, rather than any lack of interest on the part of sentencers. My last slide shows some extracts from our interviews highlighting some common themes about future hopes for the youth court. The need to reinvest the money saved through reducing the numbers of young people going through the courts was mentioned in order to address their complex needs, and also to make better progress in ensuring that all youth cases are heard in adapted courtrooms. I'm now going to pass on to Carmen, who's going to talk about the young people that we interviewed.
Thank you, Jill, and hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about young people's experiences and perceptions of youth court. So central to our research were focus groups and interviews with young people. And like Phil said, we'd like to thank them so much for their time and their insights. And thanks also to the staff at all 3 sites for putting us in touch. So we spoke with 25 young people, and if you've ever done any research around the courts, you know that's not too bad going. But given the small sample size and the qualitative nature of the interviews, we're not able to make any sweeping generalizations. That said, a lot of the same themes came up again and again in interviews and also during our observations, and we think that's definitely worth exploring. So as really beautifully captured in Reality Art's trailer, a lot of what young people told us about had to do with procedural fairness. So this is the idea that when people feel that they've been fairly treated by the justice system, regardless of the actual outcome of their case, they're more likely to trust it and see it as legitimate. So basically, when we're talking about procedural fairness, the stakes are pretty high. And there are 4 components. So understanding the process, having a voice in it, feeling that you've been treated with respect, and trusting in the neutrality of the process. And I'm going to take these in turn. So understanding, this is probably the most intuitive aspect of procedural fairness. And the young people we spoke with really appreciated efforts to help them understand. So they highlighted things like posters outside the courtroom detailing the layout, professionals doing rounds of introductions of their names and roles when the young person entered the room, special extra attention for young people identified as first-time attendees. We also managed to speak to a few young people who had experience of youth court and Crown Court, and when it came to understanding, youth court often came out better. So for example, one young person said, the ones in youth court talked to me directly, so I understood better. Unfortunately, many of the young people we spoke with actually had a very limited understanding. So they didn't know what to expect before they attended court. Often they were unable to follow proceedings as they happened. Some young people even left the courtroom still unsure of what had happened and why. I didn't even know what my sentence was because all they said was a bunch of numbers. And this lack of understanding really robbed the young people of a sense of agency. And this is especially concerning because this is meant to be a process that's centered on them, at least in part. So we had a young person saying, it just happened. Nobody was explaining what was going on. So this last bit might be painting a bit of a bleak picture, but there's a definite silver lining. And that's that a lot of what young people want around understanding, things like letting them know what to expect before they attend, explaining the outcome and the purpose of proceedings, professionals using child-friendly language. These don't require a huge amount of implementation effort. And what we found is that often it's just a matter of translating existing procedure into practice. So next is voice, and this is obviously all about young people being heard. So we had, during observations, we saw some really solid examples of magistrates and district judges making efforts to amplify the voices of young people. So for example, this is a quote from a magistrate speaking to a young person. We've talked a lot about you, but not to you. What do you think about this? And they went on to agree a later curfew with the young person. But then a lot of young people we spoke with, they felt really voiceless. So they weren't listening to me. Another young person said, I didn't think I could even slip a word in edgeways. I felt like I could only speak when I was being spoken to, and that wasn't very often at all. That was just yes, no. And often during observations, we saw that young people said nothing once they'd confirmed their name and their address, and all the talking after that was among the professionals. And some hearings were so perfunctory that there was just no time for engagement with the young person. And as well as the opportunity to be heard, young people flagged the atmosphere of the courtroom as really affecting their willingness and their ability to speak. So again, during observations, there were some really solid examples of magistrates and district judges trying to put young people at ease, so asking about their pet in one instance, asking about their family, making them more receptive to engagement, basically. But then on the other hand, we had some young people describe the courtroom as hostile. They said it made them too anxious or uncomfortable to speak. And some young people pointed to a demographic and cultural gulf between them and the bench, and they said that that made them less comfortable to speak. So, for example, one young person said, they're dead posh, them judges. And again, the improvements young people are after, as with understanding, with voice, they're not necessarily heavy lifts. So speaking directly to young people, asking their side of the story, actively listening to them, that goes a long way to improving their experience of the process. So respect, really reassuringly, lots of young people we spoke with said that they did feel that they had been treated with respect at court. So for example, I think they treat me fairly, how they treated everyone else. And during observations as well, we saw that young people were really quite receptive to displays of respect. So magistrates and district judges, they'd apologise for delays. They would ask them what name they preferred to go by. Often they would highlight their achievements and progress from yacht reports, and young people seemed to really respond to that. But there were some examples of disrespectful treatment raised. So a couple of times young people said that they felt that the benches were talking down to them. There was another example, a young person described a magistrate as borderline discriminatory for questioning their need for an intermediary. And even some standard aspects of the courtroom process were seen as disrespectful. The use of the dock in particular was seen as demeaning by a lot of young people. One young person put it really simply and said, you shouldn't have to sit in a box, which is pretty hard to argue with. And the long delays that we saw during observations and we heard about in interviews, they seemed almost a standard part of the process. And that signaled to the young people that they weren't important, that their cases didn't matter. And again, young people's ask-arounds respect are pretty straightforward. So for example, they wanted professionals to speak directly to me rather than speaking through their solicitor, and to introduce themselves. Obviously, it's not the nicest of places, but it would have made you feel better if they would introduce themselves and be nice about it. So finally, trust. And what we're talking about here is the belief that decisions are being made in an unbiased way. And really positively, perhaps surprisingly, a lot of the young people we spoke with trusted that the sentence that they had received was appropriate. So we had lots of variations on, they gave me a fair enough punishment. Also, young people often trusted the competence of staff attached to the court. And youth offending team staff in particular were often praised. So for example, one young person stressed they're really, really, really helpful. I'd say most of the young people actually praised youth offending team staff in particular. But then we had some young people who didn't view youth court as this unbiased, benevolent institution. They're actually pretty mistrustful of its intentions. So for example, one young person said there's a lot of politics going on. They were suspicious that the really patchy provision of interpreters, they didn't think that was because of a lack of resources. They really thought that it was a conscious decision to put them on the back foot. And similarly, we had another young person say, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but it was the complete opposite way around. They're there to sentence and not think you're innocent. And young people often didn't trust that the court was going to judge their case on its merits. They were worried that the outcome would rest on how they performed in court. So, for example, a young person said, I'm trying not to give a bad impression, so I keep quiet. And the dock was also sometimes seen as setting young people up to fail. One young person said, "You start sweating and look bang guilty." And securing trust is probably the most difficult of the four. This is a youth court, but we're still talking about an adversarial process. We can't trust that interests are necessarily going to align. And when we were talking to young people, it was really clear that a lot of the mistrust came from a lack of transparency. So there's a lot of work on the part of courtroom professionals to demystify their ways of working and their decision making if young people are going to trust the process. And I think ensuring that courts deliver on the other three aspects that we saw was so important to young people, understanding, voice and respect, that also will go a long way to building trust. I probably should have said this at the start, but this is all part of a focus briefing, Young People's Voices on Youth Court, that's available on our website. It might even be linked in the Q&A, but for more on this, please take a look. I'm going to hand back to Phil now.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Jill, for a great presentations that hopefully have given you in the audience an overview of what the research says. We have a great panel lined up. And what I'm going to do is ask a question of each member of the panel to get their reaction to both the report and what they've heard today. And then after that, we can open up a bit more back and forth. So just to say, on the panel with Jill and Carmen is David Lammy, Kate Aubrey-Johnson, Andy Peden, and Shaheem, Derek, and Moses from Reality Art. So just handing over to David first, I wonder if you could offer your reactions to both the report and what you've seen today, and your view on why you think reform to the youth justice system is so vital.
Well, look, I think that the video was very moving, very poignant, and captured my own experience of the justice system, not just as the MP at time, but as the person who conducted the review into our criminal justice system, where I focused quite a lot of attention on the youth justice system and the experience of disproportionality in Black and minority ethnic people in our youth justice system. I think the first thing to say is that we have not had reform, significant reform of the youth justice system for 20 years, in which there was a desire to reduce the amount of young people in the youth justice system and going to prison. And broadly, as a country, we succeeded in doing that, because at the same time, what we've not done significantly is reduce the amount of Black and minority ethnic children caught up in the youth justice system. When I completed my review 3 years ago, 41% of those in our young offenders institutions were of a Black or minority ethnic background. Today, the number is 51%. So it's got staggeringly worse. And I think that there are very few members of the public that understand that degree of disproportionality, where in fact we realise that ethnic minority communities make up just 14% of the country, have a population of 51% in our youth offenders institutions is significant. I think there are some other things that the film picked up on and the presentation picked up on. One is, of course, to recognise that many young people are in the criminal justice system because of adults, because of grooming, and because of areas of criminality. It's sometimes...
You're crackling quite a lot. I'm wondering if there's a way of improving your audio at all. Sorry to interrupt.
2 seconds, let's see if I can put this. Does it make it any better?
Yeah, I think so a bit. Yeah, sorry for interrupting.
Does it make it better enough? Yes, good.
That's much better.
Okay, so I was saying also to recognise that many young people are in prison because of our system has better at identifying as adults, not just landing on the young people. I think another issue I found is the age of maturity. Other justice systems, I'm thinking there of particularly do a lot more to maturity of young people to make sure that they're places. Nothing like that. Unfortunately, there are lots of young people caught up in settings, particularly outside prisons, which is, I think, deeply problematic. Nothing to deal with their reoffending behaviour. We've got a lot of young people, particularly from Black and minority ethnic communities, who have very low trust in the criminal justice system. You heard representations there about their perceptions of magistrates and of judges that are a very long way from the communities that they represent. There are real issues about where the working class magistrates are, where the working class judges are, and certainly where the Black and ethnic minority magistrates and judges are, remembering but just 1% of our judiciary in this country come from a Black background. And we have significant parts of the country with significant Black and minority ethnic populations where there is no Black or minority ethnic judge or magistrate in sight. And that leads to a real gap between trust and those communities. And it's why, in my review, I said there had to be a target, and the government, of course, rejected that target. So issues of maturity, issues of who is doing the judging and what are their backgrounds. And then there's another theme that I think is really, really important. And that is that we need problem-solving approaches. We need community courts, particularly for first and second time offenders. I pointed in my review to some fantastic examples in Canada, in New Zealand, in the United States, where communities are gathering around young people and their families. We're not forcing young people to plead not guilty or guilty. We're simply dealing with the young person in front of us. And I think that our system would reduce crime, can gather around the young person when they've committed their first or second time offence to deal with the problem at hand. And there's one other issue that I think is significant, and it's our criminal records regime. I think we all understand that, younger people can commit offending acts, offending behaviour. But, broadly speaking, by the time that those young people are into their late 20s, early 30s, settle down, they want to move away from that behaviour. And I think it's a tragedy that our system is condemning young people to a life of crime because they can't get a job, because they have to declare their criminal record with every employer at every single stage of the process. And of course, they're then subject to discrimination on the basis that they have a criminal record. And I don't understand why our system is doing this. So I suggested that we ought to look at sealing criminal records from employers, not from the criminal justice system if you get into an offence, but certainly allowing young people to move on with their lives, move on with getting a job, move on with getting a house, move on with settling down, and not condemn them to constantly having to relive the past. And again, I think that we need reform in our criminal justice system. So that business of a local community approach, also recognizing that, yes, you've committed an act some time ago, but now you want to move on, and allowing young people to move on. And also thinking hard about age of maturity and experience within the system. And that does mean, yes, language, and that came up, but it also means thinking harder in our system about who are our magistrates, who are our judges. So that's a starter for 10. I could go on, but I don't want to dominate the whole proceedings.
Thank you, David. And I'm aware, I said at the start that I'm aware that you may need to go during this panel. So I want to take the opportunity while you're here to ask you a couple of specific questions before moving on. As you said, your review recommended changes to youth courts and changes to youth offender panels. But they were similar in scope to recommendations made by the Taylor Review and by Alex Carlisle in his review in 2012. So it seems, and indeed in our report, so it seems like there's a consensus. So I guess part of the question that we struggle with at the centre is, why isn't there? There seems to be consensus outside of government for change. And even when you speak to magistrates and yacht professionals, there is a consensus around some of that. So why hasn't there been change over the past 20 years?
Yeah, I think it's a significant issue. You would have heard me a few weeks ago making it absolutely clear. We've had these inquiries, we've had these reviews, they've reported, they're done in good faith, they're done often in a cross-party spirit, and then they're not implemented. I'm very disappointed that despite making 35 recommendations, the vast majority of them have not been implemented. And actually, I think in some ways, the government should be going further than my review because of the figures that I shared with you a moment earlier. And I did agree a lot with what Charlie Taylor said in his review, and others have said. So there's a consensus emerging, but there's deep frustration now. I think there's frustration, and I'm afraid there's going to be a continuing diminishing of trust in the system. You know, we have that symbol of the scales of justice being balanced, and it sort of demonstrates both the impartiality of the justice system and the trust that we need to have in the justice system. And of course, I'm afraid we're finding with significant populations that there isn't that trust in the justice system, and that's a real problem. In minority ethnic communities, by the way, they're, first generation immigrants have a lot of trust in the system, largely because they're coming from parts of the world where they've experienced a really problematic criminal justice system. It's in second and third generation communities that trust is breached, and there's a different experience of the criminal justice system. Let me just give you one final example of that different experience of the criminal justice system. Here we are, it's a July morning, and let's say our universities were sitting, and let's say that we were at an ivory tower university like Oxford. It would not be a surprise to you if there were a young person at that institution this morning having a joint. The question is, would anyone call the police on that young person? And the answer to that is no, they wouldn't. Now let's imagine a same age, but probably looking slightly different young person in Salford or in Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton, walked out of the housing estate where they live with their mother and 3 brothers and sisters. They're not behind a gated community in Oxford. They can't smoke in the cramped flat that they live in. They have to step out onto the street. And guess what? They're stopped and searched by the police. They get a criminal record. And then, they end up at Her Majesty's pleasure because of that criminal record and continuing to commit crime. Differential treatment for the same crime. And that's happening day after day after day in our country. It's costing, by the way, the taxpayer a fortune. And recidivism rates in Britain, very sadly, as we speak, have gone through the roof. So something's not working. The youth justice system certainly isn't working properly with the recidivism rates that we're seeing, and neither is the broader adult population if you look at the recidivism rates of adults at the moment. And never mind, we haven't actually come on to, and the presentations didn't completely deal with, the collapse that we've seen in our probation system over this last period. So we do have some really significant issues. I think that the video picked it up, and of course the broader report and presentation picked it up very, very well. And it will require reform, it will require commitment, and I think it requires a recognition that we have to have a system, particularly when we're dealing with young people, that recognises the importance of second chances, recognises the importance of rehabilitation. And actually, because the presentations touched on the amount of young people in the care system, the amount of young people that have special educational needs that go unattended to, we also have to recognise that often the youth justice system is picking up issues that are way downstream, where young people have been excluded from school, and again, in the groups that I'm talking about, disproportionately excluded. Young people have been failed in the care system, many people understanding that the phrase looked after is one of the biggest oxymorons in the British lexicon. And young people often finding themselves, particularly if they've got mild learning difficulties like dyslexia, ADHD, finding themselves not getting the support in the health system, and therefore finding themselves in the criminal justice system. And that leads to one other phrase that we've been using that we've lost recently, but we have to revive, is that we need a public health approach to these young people, not solely a criminal justice approach. I'm sorry if the bells of the Commons are ringing while I'm speaking, but I'm here and it signifies that the Commons has started.
Thank you, David. I just want to hand over to Kate Aubrey-Johnson. I wonder if you could offer your reactions to both the report and what you've heard from David, from Jill and Carmen, and from the video. And I guess especially from your perspective of what it means for legal representatives and defence advocates.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you particularly to Reality Arts for that fantastic presentation. I think they have captured in a way that none of us professionals will now capture what it is like for children going to the youth court. So thank you to the CGI and to ICPR for this very timely report. And it's timely because the justice system is facing one of the biggest challenges it's ever faced, with the huge backlog that has arisen because of COVID-19. And it's really a blueprint for where innovation and change is needed. It's timely because it's an important reminder that the youth court, which was designed to be a specialist court, is not fulfilling that function. And it's timely because the time to get it right is now. And for me, the part of the report that resonated most strongly was the sentence, however, good practice was not consistently applied. So the framework for delivering a really good youth court, which is child-centred, is there. The legal and policy framework is there. It's just not happening in practice. And what the report signals is that there needs to be a culture change. And for me, the driver for that culture change is better training, and particularly better training of lawyers. So my personal view is that it's just completely unacceptable that lawyers can go into the youth court when they're very junior, without experience, and more importantly, without any specific training in understanding the children that they will be representing. And one of the quotes that was referred to was that one of the lawyers described themselves as learning on the job. I'm afraid that I was a junior barrister and the expression was "you cut your teeth in the youth court," and that's just unacceptable. It should be a court that is considered as having far greater status, and that lawyers have to acquire the skills and expertise in order to represent children. So I wholeheartedly endorse the recommendation that both the Solicitors Regulation Authority and the Bar Standards Board should put in place an accreditation framework to set out the minimum standard of training that lawyers should undertake, because I think that would then be the catalyst for ensuring that the other elements that are falling down are addressed. So delay, ensuring children are diverted. So the principle that initially when a child comes into the criminal justice system, diversion should be considered. If it's been missed, the lawyer can pick it up, and ensuring procedural fairness. The words that came across from the Reality Arts presentation about the youth court being intimidating and frightening, lawyers should, that's their job, to demystify the process and to ensure that those children and young people trust their lawyer to represent them and to have their back. And that includes ensuring that the BAME disproportionality that starts with over arrest of these communities is addressed and nipped in the bud, because the lawyers are addressing it. Because David is absolutely right to say that the tragedy is, despite him flagging up all the areas that needed to change, BAME disproportionality has increased since his report and increased significantly. So what is needed, in my opinion, and what this report helpfully lays out, is a culture change. And with that culture change, the natural consequence of that will be a much more problem-solving approach.
Thanks, Kate. And just one thing to get your sort of quick reaction to. One of the things that struck me about both what Carmen was saying and what was represented in the reality art video was the lack of voice. And I know that is an issue for lawyers. Of often they don't want their clients to speak because they think they'll incriminate themselves. How do youth court advocates balance those two seemingly competing things?
Well, I think, thank you for asking that question, because I think the words that came across from the report that I thought were really important to highlight were words like praise and dignity and respect. And they're not necessarily part of any lawyer's training. So lawyers have been trained to use really complicated words, to sound really clever, to intimidate and to ask challenging questions, to probe the evidence. And really, when they get to the youth courts, they have to unlearn all of that. And I think the answer to your question is there are ways of making sure that the child they are representing feels at the centre of proceedings. And that comes from understanding why it is so important that that child effectively participates in the court hearing. And once a lawyer understands and has received the training to understand the importance that effectively participating in that court hearing is key to that child going on to stop offending, then the lawyer can find ways around their initial anxiety and concern that if they allow the child they're representing to start speaking, they may incriminate themselves.
Thanks, Kate. And now I just want to get Andy Peden's response and reaction to the report and to what he's heard today, and especially obviously the perspective on those things from the perspective of the youth offending teams.
Thanks, Phil. I'm head of service at Leeds Youth Justice Service, and we were one of the pilot areas for the report. So very much welcome it. Very much welcome the pointers in the right direction in terms of how we might be able to change things going forward. And I just want to start by reflecting on a bit of practice that we've done in Leeds, following some other services lead around redesigning the referral order process, because I think it might have some interesting parallels to this. So we utilised a model devised by Remedy, who are a third sector organisation who do work in a number of services and probation services in the north of England, and that was very much around a restorative approach to referral orders, because we felt that we were just repeating the court process, and young people fundamentally didn't understand what was happening to them in the context of a referral order panel, and that actually they were being asked to go over stuff that they thought that they'd dealt with already in court, and we were just repeating that process. So that has been dismantled and put back together with a focus on looking forward, on making things right, and on having the young person at the centre of those discussions. So it's making it right for the young person, it's making it right for the family, it's making it right for the victims, and as I say, that whole design has been redrafted with the sole focus of trying to get young people to talk and to engage more in the process, and it's been spectacularly successful from the part of young people who don't feel that they're being processed and feel that they're being listened to. The panelists think it's wonderful because young people are empowered to talk to them. We do a very low-level plan, which is the young person's plan, so they're not being processed in terms of having a bit of criminal justice system stuck on them. It's asking their views and their hopes and desires for moving forward. So I think we need to learn from that, and I think we need to pick out the aspects of the study in relation to trying to make things better for young people across the spectrum. So the study flags a lot of work that's done to try and empower and enable young people to understand what's happening, but also flags how difficult it is to get that achieved consistently. I also just wanted to flag 2 cases that we've had in the last couple of weeks to show probably just how far we have to try and get it right across the system. So we've got a 15-year-old young man who we think almost inevitably should have been diverted because of criminal exploitation issues, yet we got him after a guilty plea had already been accepted at a neighbouring court and a PSR requested. We had to do a lot of work with mum and the solicitor to explain the concept of modern day slavery and the potential statutory defence, and did manage to get an adjournment to try and chase up a national referral mechanism referral, which had been made by social work, but there was very little join up between the yacht, children's services and the solicitor, and the family were very angry and upset about what they saw as massive delays already. Ironically, our interventions caused additional delays, but hopefully we might be able to get a different outcome in due course, and we felt that very much that young man may have been presented as being difficult, but we were able to present a different narrative to the court. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had a 13-year-old girl with very serious mental health, emotional health concerns, with deprivation of liberty safeguards in place through social care. She's looked after, she's got an education, health and care plan, and possibly isn't fit to plea. And she's coming to court for assault emergency worker offences, which have been as a result of the police being called because of behavioural issues in a children's home. So this young girl is triggered by noises and cuffs and ended up in the dock and needing to be restrained in the courtroom, which was extremely distressing for her and everybody else in the courtroom. So we've tried to put plans in place to avoid her being arrested, but unfortunately that hasn't happened, and so she's been back in court on a number of occasions for very, very similar issues, which is fundamentally depressing, because and the irony there in terms of Leeds is we fought really hard, because Leeds Youth Court is the best facilities that there are in West Yorkshire in terms of child friendly, yet young people are still expected to go into the dock when they come up from custody. So it's just it just highlights really how far we've got to go in terms of trying to change our practice, trying to work with partners to get a better experience, and to try and move that focus around young people so that young people can understand that. So the positive side of things is we've got a report that we will then be able to share with our partners. It's going to our partnership board next week, and that will hopefully provide the focal point for us being able to make some changes to the way things operate in Leeds in the future.
Thanks, Andy. And I think you just ask a question of reality art. So, I mean, everyone who's seen that video knows how powerful it is. What are your hopes about how the youth court can be changed and how the youth justice system should be changed? What are the 1 or 2 things you think would most important in terms of changing the system?
Sorry, you broke up. Could you say that again?
What are the 1 or 2 things that you'd most like to see to change the youth justice system?
Trust and honesty and understanding. Because a lot of people seem to lie about things they can't do for young people. You know what I mean? E.g., every time you go probation, see that probation will always give you a job for like a short period of time.
then just leave them in the dust. Then after that, what do you expect people to do, if you know what I mean?
And can I just add to that, yeah? When they're sentencing people in court, just make sure like what they're sentencing them to is like rehabilitative instead of just punishment. Because that's not gonna, punishment's not really do much. So yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I think we've got time, we've got about sort of half an hour just for some questions that have been asked in advance and asked as we've sort of been talking. So if I can just ask any member of the panel to put up their hand. So the first question is, would the panel like to comment on the issue of some first-time young offenders ending up in court when they've given a no-comment interview, which prevents the opportunity for them to be dealt with under a possible out-of-court disposal? I think I can direct that partly at Kate. Again, it comes down to the issue of lawyers often are, trying to protect their client and want them to give no comment interviews, but that can sometimes mean that they don't get a lesser disposal.
Yes, thank you. Well, the answer to the question is, my view is that diversion should be open and considered even where an admission isn't made at the police station. That's particularly important because we know, because of the levels of distrust of authority, that certain communities are less likely to make those admissions. So the no comment interview may not be because the lawyer has advised it. It may be because the child has decided they don't want a lawyer, they want to get out there as quickly as possible, and their friends have told them just go no comment. It may be because there is an appropriate adult who is a parent and they feel that they can't be honest in front of the parent at that point, and because that police interview might be highly pressurized, they may have been sitting in a police cell for some time. And you're right, sometimes they may be advised to make a no comment interview because the lawyer does not feel at that point that there's evidence that they have committed an offence. The answer is both to open up the option for out-of-court disposals where there haven't been admissions, and there are examples of those sort of programmes available for adults, and it's the deferred prosecution model that David Lammy talked about. But also there should be the safeguards that there should be an opportunity to make representations to the Crown Prosecution Service to consider diversion before it gets to court. And for lawyers, the real challenge is two things. One, the release under investigation means that they lose track of cases. They assume cases may get dropped or they assume they may be dealt with by diversion, and then they suddenly pop up in court because a child is requisitioned. And so the ability for lawyers to follow those cases through is thwarted because of the process that's been introduced through release under investigation, which we hope desperately the Home Office will reform after their consultation. So the opportunity for lawyers to make those representations, because there may be background information that decision makers do not have. And of course, we know very often that children come to court when they've had time to reflect and are willing to make an admission at a later date. So yes, and finally, if it does get to court and a child is happy or willing to make an admission, then the door is not closed, and lawyers should always pursue asking the court for an adjournment in order to allow for diversion to be considered, and regularly the Youth Offending Service are instrumental in triggering that to happen. But it's again, the problem is if you don't have a lawyer who's been trained and is a child specialist, then they see the opportunity to get a referral order as an easy win, because the consequences aren't as serious as the sentences available, for example, if you're an adult. So it's really important that diverting those children, reducing the chances of them getting a criminal record, as David Lammy said, and impeding their future chances are pursued.
Great. Did anyone else want to come in on that question?
I will say that during observations, we did see a couple of really low-level cases come to court, and we were really happy to see them batted back by the magistrate. But there was just a frustration that it got there in the first place. All the things that Kate mentioned to kind of safeguard that escalation to court. But it was good to see that the magistrates were willing to send it back.
Great, thank you, Carmen. So moving to another question. So I'm going to try and wrap a couple of questions up into one. So a number of our members of our audience have asked via the Q&A function how youth courts deal with and how they could improve dealing with the fact that many young people who come to court are vulnerable. Some of them are associated with and exploited by gangs, and how both youth courts and youth offending teams have responded to those issues and how their practice is influenced by trauma and how informed that practice is around trauma. And I wonder if Andy had any particular reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we understand the concept of adverse childhood experiences and of the impact of trauma much better now than we did a few years ago, and also the issue of criminal exploitation and the fact that young people are often encouraged to go down particular routes and you know, aren't fully aware of the consequences of that. And I think that I guess that we probably need to be able to shift youth offending services involvement earlier upstream in terms of being able to deal with that more appropriately, because sometimes when we get involved, certainly for young people at first time entrants coming in and they're already in the system and have already been arrested for serious offences, it makes that much harder to achieve. So you need to be able to understand young people better. We need to be able to develop those relationships. The guys at Reality Arts talked about trust and honesty. And before you can have those conversations, you need to be able to develop those relationships. We've done an awful lot of work on that over the past few years, and recognise that actually without that, we're never going to be successful. So, but that doesn't come straight away. You know, it's not something that you can get on first meeting of individuals. So. So I think we've tried to look at how our processes support that across the service. We need to work more with partners as to how other bits of the criminal justice system work to achieve that as well. So the case that I've just talked about in terms of the 13-year-old girl, that that's absolutely her behaviour. Will be because of whatever adverse childhood experiences. The process of being taken into care is an adverse childhood experience, and it's complex and complicated, and it takes time to resolve. So we need to find a place in the system to be able to do that to make the difference.
Thank you, Andy. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that issue of sometimes the system looks at people as offenders first and forgets the fact that they're often vulnerable and have themselves been victims of crime. And I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that point. Jill, will you?
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say in one of our research sites, a young person who was initially in court for breach, the YOS flagged to the court that he was being criminally exploited, and then this was the site that was using the kind of more problem-solving review hearings, and he was helped through one of these hearings. So there was a kind of yeah, it was raised in court that doing breach proceedings would not be the best way to go, and that they needed to take some other approach, and the magistrates were open to that.
Thank you. I wonder if, again, really for all of the panel, whether they have any kind of reflections on whether the COVID-19 pandemic has put more pressure on youth courts, or whether it provides an opportunity for reform in a particular way. Obviously, we've seen in the press huge backlogs occurring around people coming to court, but we've also heard that things like the Crown Prosecution Service has said in their guidance that means we need to divert way more people from court. And I just wondered if people had any reflections on what they think the impact of COVID-19 will be on the future of the youth justice system. Who wants to take that on first?
Shall I just come in? Yeah, I agree, Phil, that both the legal guidance produced by the Crown Prosecution Service and the circumstances that we have over a backlog of over 500,000 criminal cases mean that diversion seems the an obvious way to reduce the new cases coming into the system. I hope that the legacy of the backlog that has arisen and the way in which the courts are trying to return to hearing cases is that there will be a change of practice. So, for example, I've heard examples of courts listing cases at specific times. Talks in the report about the fact that usually in a youth court all cases are listed at 10 a.m. So young people immediately are annoyed and frustrated because they're waiting around for often a very long time, and sometimes the whole day. That also means that children returning to court don't necessarily turn up on time, and that can get them into trouble. So both listing the cases at a specific time and giving them longer slots, triggered by the social distancing requirements, but meaning that actually each case may get the attention it deserves. And picking up on the previous question, it's really easy. Earlier reports have talked about sort of conveyor belt justice in the youth court. It's really easy for children to plead guilty and get a referral order and go through the system very quickly without an exploration of their individual background and finding out more about them. So early opportunities to spot child criminal exploitation, grooming by county lines, gangs, for what are initially low-level offences are missed. So that legacy and a change of practice. We've also heard the Secretary of State talking about community courts, community buildings being used for courts, Nightingale courts or Blackstone courts. It may be that the recommendation of your report that the court layout should reflect the guidance that the layout of a youth court accommodating the needs of children will be easily facilitated, because courtrooms and court hearings will be happening in community settings that naturally lend themselves to setting up a courtroom all on one level in a conference style seating arrangement, which in itself facilitates communication and helps to build the trust that we've heard the young people saying is really important to them. But the negatives are the long delays that were already an inherent challenge to the youth court and to justice being served. We in your report, you referred to 18-month delays. Well, anecdotally, I'm hearing of cases involving children being adjourned until September 2021. So the likelihood of children waiting a very long time for their cases to be heard is a reality for many. It means it's a problem for children on remand. We know that the prisons are unable to provide the rehabilitative support that they should be able to, the conditions are stark. And also there's been an increase in the number of video hearings, and we know that they're really hard for children to participate in. And so that might be a negative legacy, that they'll be more used. And what we've talked about is low-level speech and communication needs, which are are not diagnosed when a child comes before the court, they're even more likely to be missed if children are appearing on a video link. And the immense pressure that's going to be placed on the system, because we're going to have a sudden increase in the number of children who are receiving sentences and need to be supervised by the Youth Offending Service. And also, I think there will in reality be an increase in offending, because there is going to be a whole generation of children who've grown up through austerity. They've turned 16 during the pandemic, and they may have been excluded from education. And you will have seen reports in the recent weeks that there has not been provision for their education and training beyond 16. And we know the statistics are likely to show that the impact of unemployment, that will be the legacy of the economic impact of the pandemic, is more likely to be felt by young adults. So that is the less positive news that will come out of the pandemic. And of course, leaving young people with a criminal record is an even greater hindrance to them going on to pursuing employment.
Andy, did you want to come in on the same question?
Yeah, Kate's covered it pretty well, but just to re-emphasise, if you want to make a process that's pretty confusing and not understandable, even worse, then do it over a video link. It doesn't really fit. It's been with the exception of use for young people who are already in custody and stopping them having to go back into periods of isolation. I think it's not been well used at all. But I just wanted to add that I think one of the positives that we might be able to take out of it is just on the recommendations around the sort of sharing of information. So it might be unsuitable for young people to attend, but it might be very suitable for social workers or CAMS professionals to be able to dial into court hearings and to support that, or even to do a 10-minute video call to submit on behalf of that young person that might add significantly to the court's view of proceedings.
Right. I mean, the other thing outside of COVID-19 that's happened since we concluded our research is obviously the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen in the UK after the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, David's report reported back in, I think, 2016-17, if I remember rightly, which called for sweeping changes to the criminal justice system, but particularly the youth justice system, to rectify racial disparity. We've now obviously had the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK over the past few months. We've seen football players taking a knee. All of that energy. The question that's in everyone's minds is this just a series of protests, or is it going to lead to actual action and reform? And I wonder if, again, if any of the panel have any reflections on whether they feel hopeful that those protests will lead to changes in the youth justice system, or whether we're still going to be encountering the barriers that David's review has had. So I guess it's a question about, do we think there's hope and opportunity, or is it just going to be a series of protests that we remember in 12 months' time happened, but nothing changed? Does anyone want to come in on that question? Andy?
Yeah. I mean, it's a massive issue, isn't it? And we know that it's very much a criminal justice system issue. So, those of us that work in the criminal justice system have a responsibility to do our part to try and address that wherever we can. We held a special AYM executive meeting last week to put together a report that we're going to submit to the Justice Select Committee, which is sitting on youth justice at the moment. And I guess, you know, the concept of explain or reform that David introduced in his review is really, really important. So, you know, we need to be able to understand what the data is telling us, and that's on a macro level, but also on an individual level in terms of organisations, and we need to be able to use that to work with other bits of the system in terms of having challenging conversations about where individual agencies' practice doesn't assist in that issue. But I think we also need to understand where our young people are in terms of their fears, their concerns, supporting them to understand the dynamics, supporting them to be able to challenge those issues appropriately on an individual level when they occur, because we're aware that a number of transactions that, you know, may go in a different direction as a result of those you know, different interactions. So it's you know, to answer your question, Phil, I would hope that it's not going to drift away. I think that it's been a significant issue in the criminal justice system for a long time, and we need to use this additional momentum to try and make an impact, and do that individually across each agency, each organisation, each different part of that organisation.
And I don't know if Reality Art or Kate or Jill or Carmen want to come in on that issue. You know, Black Lives Matter is hopefully is providing energy to the sort of reforms that Andy, as he said, has known that have long been an issue. But I wonder if anyone else wants to come in. Okay.
I think the key word here is trust, and you can only trust in a system that is fair. So for the lawyers, I think it's really important that they hold the system to account and they ensure that the children they represent go through a fair process, and where it isn't fair, they challenge it through legal channels. And they need to be exhaustive in every single case they do to ensure that children get a fair process, and that's where the trust will come from. So yeah, I think it's an energy, that a fire in our belly, that we have to take with us to court every day, and we have to name it. We have to be open with the young people we represent that historically the system has been unfair, but we will challenge it, and we will do our best to ensure that there's that child goes through a fair process.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Shaheem, Derek and Moses, your views on it?
Sorry, I didn't get the Harry. Can you answer the question again?
The question is obviously we've seen over the past few, the other thing that's changed over the past few months since our research was written up is the other Black Lives Matters protests. The question, I think, which is in all our minds is that just a series of protests, or is it actually going to translate into action and activity in reforming the criminal justice system and reforming indeed other parts of society? And the question is really, do the Black Lives Matter protests and energy behind it, does that give you hope for the future? Or do you think it's still not clear whether that's going to lead to any action?
Yeah, so generally speaking, like a lot of young people I speak to, they're not for it at all, because like they've seen it happen time and time again over the amount of years, and they don't know if there's going to be change. Whereas the other half have hope. So it's like the half that have hope is like they want to keep raising awareness, but like where do we go to make change?
And how long do you want us to make awareness for, basically, as well?
And how long do you want us to protest for?
Because once the protests and that stop, that's when it's like everything stops with it. So it's like, how long do you want us to carry on going until you make change? And you should do it immediately.
So I guess it comes down to sort of, I mean, you said the sort of trust and honesty, and we've seen symbolically people making efforts, but I guess what I'm hearing you're saying is there's a lot of skepticism amongst young people as to whether that's actually ever going to make any real difference on the ground.
Yeah, so like change will be like the main motivator. So once there's like more change, more people will be in tune.
You're in proof of change too. Let people see change actually happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think we've probably got time for one more question. So I'm going to just quickly look through the questions we have. One of the issues that has been raised in the Q&A is this link between, and Andy picked up on it a bit, the link between a youth justice system, family justice system, and a care system. Often the young people who come into both are in both of those systems. And it's been, again, it's been one of those issues that's been a focus of a lot of reviews, a lot of research showing that young people who are in the youth justice system are often the care system. We found in our work that while the yachts were doing a sterling job, often the communication between them and children's services wasn't always perfect. And so one of the questions in the Q&A is, should we move to a system like they have in Scotland, where youth justice and the care system are actually brought together in children's hearing panels? So I guess part of the question is, should we do that? But also, like, even if we don't do that, how do we make sure those two systems speak more to each other and work better together?
That question for us, I wouldn't be able to answer that. I don't have a child.
Oh, it's a question for anyone on the panel. Who wants to take that on? Okay.
I could make a few initial observations. I mean, it's absolutely right that too many looked after children end up in the criminal justice system, and quite often they end up in the criminal justice system because the care system has failed them. So I think a part of the way to address that is to, I'm going to say this because this is what I believe in, is to improve the quality and training of lawyers so that they are specialists, so they understand what should be happening in the care system, or what family court proceedings might be going on, and they provide the criminal court with the information that will inform the decision. I heard once about a family judge walking over to a youth court to explain the order that the family judge intended to make, so that could help assist the criminal court, the youth court, in making their decision. But of course that information could be readily shared, and also it's about ensuring that children's rights are protected within the care system. So if there's two case studies provided in the report. One of them is about a child who was on remand because children's services couldn't find suitable accommodation for them. I mean, that just, the legal framework shouldn't allow that to happen. A lawyer should have been ensuring that that child was accommodated, and if it takes a letter before claim and a threat of judicial review in order for that to happen. But equally, the court should have been advised that if they remanded the child to local authority accommodation, a bed would have to be found. So I think some of this stems from a lack of training and a lack of awareness of the duties owed to these children, but definitely a more collaborative approach, so that the problem is the criminal justice system picks up all of these cases, and children end up in the criminal justice system when really they should be being dealt with by other services and other interventions.
Andy, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the data from your report, I think on our site the 17% was the average number of looked after children that were coming through the court cohort, which is far too high. Perhaps even worse when you consider that I think the highest site was 21% and the lowest site was 12%. So differential practice, is probably explained by differential processes in terms of being able to divert looked after children out of the system in the first place. And I think, you know, it's a result of the increased complexities of the cohort as more cases have been diverted. The two fields have come closer. So you know, anything that you know would support a more joined up approach from services that are trying to support young people, anything that involves young people being more included in the whole process, I think would definitely be welcomed. So, you know, the Scottish system seems to me to have tick a number of those boxes. So, you know, I think we'd probably welcome a move in that direction.
Thank you, Andy. And apologies, but we're going to have to wrap things up. So apologies to all those who've asked questions that we could not get to. So just finally, thanks obviously to David, to Shaheem, Derek and Moses at Reality Art. We will be sharing your video, and we've already had people asking whether they can use it to train judges and magistrates. So we'll be in touch with you about that. A very powerful piece. Thanks to Kate, Andy, Jill and Carmen. I want to give thanks obviously to the panel for what I think has been a fascinating discussion. To reiterate how grateful we are to the Nuffield Foundation for sponsoring this work and this research. For those of you who are interested in taking forward some of the ideas and practices that we've discussed today, please do get in touch with us at the Centre for Justice Innovation. Part of our job is to push for policy reform, but also part of our hope is that there is space out there for practice to develop from the bottom up, and we stand ready to help all of you. Please get in touch with us at info@justiceinnovation.org if you want to be on our bulletins and mailing lists, and please do follow us on Twitter. As I said, the Reality Art video will be available to you all. We'll also ask David, and apologies for his sound being not the best quality at the start, and we'll ask David to provide his thoughts to flesh out some of his comments in a bit more detail, because I think all of us missed the first sort of 5 minutes of that. So just to say thanks all for attending. I hope you all have pleasant and splendid afternoons, and stay safe. Thank you very much.